Hello, everyone. Welcome to Theory, Unit 2. And thank you for your patience in the delivery of this lecture to you. So I'm just going to get started right away and share my screen. So today's lecture is on the theme of ecology, and I'm going to talk about some basics of sort of ecological terms, which also apply to architecture, and there's a lot of sort of overlap. So some of this might be familiar from your kind of biology class or whatnot, and some might be new. So the term ecology comes from the Greek oikos for house or environment, and then the study of. So the study of the environment or the study of the house. And ecology means the scientific analysis and study of interactions among organisms and their environment. So again, it's between people, animals, and their environment. And now I just want to go through some basic kind of ecological terms. So population is really the relationship of organisms to peers of their own type. So for example, a population of reindeer, a population of birds. Social behaviors emerge, of course, from being a part of a population or part of a group, such as in this case, a swarm. Population of humans, for example, walking through a busy urban environment. So it's a single organism of the same type as they relate to one another. In ecology, a community is a group or association of populations of two or more different species that occupy the same geographical area at the same time. So in its simplest form, this can refer to groups of organisms, in the same place and time. For example, the fish community of the Sunning wetlands pre-industrialization. So there's multiple types of fish that are coexisting in the same place, and I'm specifying a specific time period, pre-industrialization. So this is what a community is in terms of ecologies. And there's two types of communities, biotic and abiotic. And biotic describes the relationship between types of living things. So predator-prey is one type of biotic relationship. And of course, this serves a function. It also keeps biological populations in check. It keeps numbers kind of stable, right? Another type of biotic relationship is mimicry. And mimicry in biology is a phenomenon characterized by the kind of superficial or outward resemblance of two or more organisms that are not actually related to each other at all. For example, in this case, the orchid and the bee. And so this physical resemblance, the fact in this case that the orchid looks like the bee, is advantageous in some way. For example, in another animal, it might, or situation, it might protect from predation, right? But in any case, so in this example that I have here, as I said, we see an orchid that actually looks like the female bee. And this resemblance is so close that the male bee visits the flower and thus collecting the pollen and transmitting them to other flowers. And so this benefits both the orchid in terms of its ability to propagate, as well as the bee, which depends on the pollen. So we have a kind of mutual symbiosis through the kind of use of mimicry. A non-mutual relationship is one that benefits one species but not the other. So it does not cause harm to the other. For example, in this case, we see the tree is not harmed necessarily by the raccoon living in it. And here we have an example of symbiosis, which comes from Greek as well, meaning living together. And this is any type of close and long-term biological interaction between two different biological organisms. So it can be mutualistic, or it can be parasitic. But in this particular example, we see an example of mutualism, which describes the ecological interaction between two or more species where each species has a net benefit. So unlike the raccoon, who is benefited by the tree but is not harming the tree, in this case, both the remora, these smaller fish, and the shark are benefiting. Namely because the remora gets food scraps from the shark, from their waste, and also cleaning sort of parasites off of the shark's body. And they also are protected by the shark. And they kind of receive a ride, right? They don't need to exert as much energy moving because the shark kind of carries them. But again, like I said, the shark is parasite free. So both species are benefiting from this relationship. In this case, we have a parasitic relationship. And this is a type of symbiotic relationship which does not have a mutual benefit. So in this case, between the tick and the deer, the tick is benefiting, but the deer does not benefit from this relationship. Now, the other type of relationship I wanted to talk about are the abiotic relationships. And this is the relationship between living and non-living things, as opposed to living and other living things. And so abiotic factors include things like temperature. How do organisms situate themselves based on temperature? And here you can see a kind of map of kind of global temperatures around the world. And of course, this will greatly affect where organisms live and how they interact. Living in desolate landscapes, organisms can adapt. Humans are perhaps the most adaptive animal on the planet, or one of them. I shouldn't say the most, perhaps, but we are able to live in just a broad range of climates and conditions. For example, here in the tundra to the desert, where there is very little rainfall. And annual precipitation also, of course, affects how organisms adapt and where they live. People have adapted to living with water. They build their structures on stilts, for example, in order to allow for the rainfall, in order to allow the kind of ground to flood, right? And so the stilted house is protecting the kind of structure from any damage in these fluctuating water levels. The stilted house also keeps out pests, right? So, any critters or animals that could otherwise get into the house, you're a little bit more protected from in this case. There's also factors of elevation. So this is a map kind of describing elevation globally. And again, people have used stilts to deal with terrain. That's one way to deal with how do we live, how do we adapt to this kind of environment. There's also sunshine, light, which is very important. So right now we're close to the equinox. if we look at this chart, we can see actually Wenzhou is about at 27.9 degrees in terms of its latitude. So that means it gets about 10 hours of sunlight and 14 hours of darkness at the winter solstice, and about 14 hours of sunlight and 10 hours of darkness during the summer solstice. So that's not too drastically different, but there is some fluctuation, right? Between summer and winter, there's more light, obviously, in the summer when we're in the northern hemisphere. Right now, where I am, I'm in Stockholm. That's at 60 degrees north, or 59 to be exact. In the summer, we have 6 hours of daylight and 18 hours of, sorry, in the winter solstice, we have 6 hours of daylight and 18 hours of darkness. So very, very little light, actually. And of course, those 6 hours of light are not bright necessarily. That's from, going through the sunrise and the sunset. It's just, it ends up being just a few hours of light. And then in the summer solstice, on the other hand, we have 20 hours of light and 4 hours of darkness. So, you'll always go to bed pretty much when it's bright out, and you'll wake up when it's bright out. So very, very different. So depending on where we're situated in terms of latitude, light has a huge effect. It has a huge effect on the climate, but it also has a huge effect on the way people live, and the culture of that place, and how they kind of prioritize light in terms of their architecture, both for psychological well-being, but also productivity and so forth. And light also sculpts space, right? Without light, it forms space itself. So light is essential to think about as an architect, in terms of, if you think of space as sculpting light. It also creates atmospheric effects. And in the case of the Pantheon, the building becomes a sort of living calendar machine, with the oculus letting in the light and kind of being very easy to read what time of year it is, what time of day it is, right? It's a sort of living clock in that way. Now I want to talk about biomes. The Earth is separated into major biomes, which are characterized by specific temperatures, levels of rainfall, as well as elevation. So all of these abiotic kind of factors that I was talking about are what define the different biomes in the world. And these factors, of course, affect then things like vegetation and living conditions, abundance of life generally. So let's take a look at the physiognomy of biomes. Physiognomy just means the way something looks, the general form or appearance of something. So let's take a look at what these biomes look like. The desert. The desert is a barren area of landscape where there is very little precipitation, right? Very little rainfall. And consequently, the living conditions are hostile for plant and animal life. The lack of vegetation exposes the unprotected surface of the ground to the process of denudation, which is the wearing away of the Earth's surface. So here you can see the desert in Namibia as it meets the sea. Very beautiful, but very barren, and is very kind of harsh landscape to live in. These are the Himba people. And of course, people have adapted to live in this kind of hostile climate. For example, in the distance, you can see the use of packed mud as an available building material for this hut, which is very, very effective in keeping cool during the hot days and warm during the cold nights of the desert. The house is lifted so that in periods of rainfall, when the ground becomes extremely unstable, the house does not flood or get destroyed. And even, as you can see, this woman, she has smeared herself with this reddish paste, and this actually protects her from the sun. So in a way, she is taking the environment around her and not only making her home, but also kind of covering her skin. Sort of, if the house is one form of a covering. This paste is another. We have the people of the Gobi Desert, for example, here in this image from Mongolia, who work with other animals like hawks to hunt. The Gobi Desert is, of course, cold and has very low levels of precipitation. The Sahara Desert people also live in an incredibly harsh environment. And this is characterized by nomadic communities, meaning that they move around from place to place, nomadic. And they have survived this way for many, many, many years. And this mobility has also enabled the kind of trans-Saharan trade, right? But so this idea of not having a permanent spot, but actually being mobile. The second biome I want to look at is the tundra. And this is an area where tree growth is not possible because of the very low temperatures and the short growing season. And so the word tundra comes from the Russian word for uplands or treeless mountain tract. Tundra vegetation, you will have some is sort of shrubs, sedges and grasses, mosses and lichens. Scattered trees can grow in some tundra regions. And this sort of ecotone or the ecological boundary between the tundra and the forest is known as the tree line. So that's the boundary when you suddenly get into the region where there's trees, you've hit the tree line and you've crossed into a new biome. For example, here we can see the Sami people who live in northern Scandinavia and Russia. And they're indigenous, also nomadic people who live in harmony with reindeer. They depend on the reindeer for fur, meat, and transportation. And they've lived like this for a very, very long time. Modern forms of architecture like this mobile research center in Antarctica also have adjusted to life in the tundra. This has allowed people to explore areas seasonally, moving away as the ice thins or as the research area is shifted. And so you can see there kind of these massive structures elevated on sort of skis. The tropical rainforest biome occur in areas where there's no dry season at all. All months have an average precipitation or rainfall of at least 60 millimeters. True rainforests are typically found between 10 degrees north and south of the equator. They're a subset of tropical forest biome that occurs roughly within the 28-degree latitudes. Tropical rainforests are a type of tropical moist broadleaf forest that also includes the more extensive seasonal tropical forests. So it has a range of conditions. But indigenous people of the tropical rainforest biome enjoy plentiful biodiversity and resources. Here are some remarkable photos of uncontacted people, of which they still exist in Brazil and in the Amazon. And you can see here, they're sort of aiming an arrow right at the camera. And it's kind of an amazing moment because they don't have contact with the modern world. And so they're probably very frightened by what they see as presumably some kind of helicopter. But it's an amazing thing to consider that other forms of living still exist. And in this kind of rich, thick, thickly vegetated biome, there are people still living in complete isolation. The Yanomami tribe in South America, here we can see how the material from the forest is directly used in the construction of this dwelling for this community. And here we have the entire village living under one roof. Now I want to talk about, and there are other biomes, but these are just a few, about the kind of human interventions, where we also pretty much create new biomes and the sort of patterns that emerge. Our impact on the face of the planet is immense, and I hope that these kind of images start to describe that. Here's an image of agricultural development in Ethiopia. You can see this incredible kind of patchwork of man-made landscape. Here we have central pivot irrigation fields in Saudi Arabia. So this circular pattern occurs as the crops are watered by overhead sprinklers that are mounted to these rotating towers. So we can see these circles or rings of agriculture. Here's an image of agriculture in Kansas in the United States. And you see a kind of combination again of these central pivot irrigation and regular agricultural fields. We can see the sculpted land of Yunnan, where we see this rice paddy terracing. And the mountains in this area have been cultivated for rice for the last 1,300 years. It's quite incredible sculpting of the landscape by human beings. Here is an image of vineyards in Huelva, Spain. And the climate here is ideal for grape growing. It has mild temperatures in the winter and spring and long hot summers. And so you can see grape cultivation. And here we can see greenhouses or plasticulture meeting a kind of mountain face in Spain. And so how the topography in this case is kind of creating an edge condition for this man-made landscape meeting the natural landscape. And then of course we have the urban or suburban human interaction with the environment. For example, here in Arizona, this in the USA, this is an RV park, so a recreational vehicle park. The city blocks of Barcelona. The sort of gated communities of Boca Raton, Florida, USA, where each little square or portion of this quilt is kind of its own miniature world, its own miniature landscape. Or this development in Brøndby Haveby, Denmark, which is a community outside of Copenhagen, where you can see almost this kind of biomimicry, right? It almost looks like the growth of a plant. But these houses centered around these cul-de-sacs or round kind of dead ends, right? Creating this interesting pattern. Here we have the Desert Shores community in Las Vegas. So this kind of repetition of sameness, right? The same type of building, very tightly controlled and articulated. We have something as delicate as Venice, Italy, right? We all know that Venice is sinking. We don't know what its fate is, or at least how quickly it will reach its fate. But it's a city on an island, right? Or it's on a group of islands, separated by canals and bridges, and where there are no cars. Quite interesting typology. Puente de Vallecas in Madrid. And again, the kind of um, repeated copy paste fabric of suburbia. This is a residential development in Texas. Versus something where we see an urban pattern that is working with its environment, right? It's following this kind of island shape, its axes. This is in Germany, in Nordlingen. So a very different type. And here's Cape Town, South Africa, another city which is also impacted by its topography, its environment, right? So it's built up sort of on the flat part of the land, and then as the mountain abruptly rises, the city sort of stops. And so we can see this edge, this very sharp edge, which gets created. And then we have other places where the edge is very artificial, arbitrary, where humans have just kind of decided, I guess the edge will be here for now, right? And this is a residential area in Las Vegas, I believe. We have Central Park here in Manhattan in New York City, an incredible artificial landscape contained in the city. Many people think of it as a kind of preserved plot of land, but it's actually highly, highly designed as well. Vatican City, a city within a city, right? An independent state, actually, country, where the Pope resides, the seat of the Catholic Church within Rome. And here we have this amazing urban space of St. Peter's Square, which creates these axes into the city. These are some artificial islands in Florida, 2 residential neighborhoods, and man-made islands. And this is in Beran when it was being constructed, these 15 artificial islands. Only visible from, this pattern is very interesting. It's really only visible from space or from the plane or right from the drone. It's not something, not a shape or a form that you would experience, but it's a kind of plan aesthetic. Let's talk about some other types of human intervention. So here we have a photo of Amazon rainforest deforestation in Brazil. This is a photo of Para. It's a state in northern Brazil. And it's easy to see here the effects of the deforestation, the removal of the forest. Fisheries have a huge impact on the environment. This is a fishery, I believe, in Norway. Military, the sort of military effect on the landscape, right? The kind of trace of these massive, massive operations. And so this is a missile storage, aircraft and missile storage and maintenance facility for the US Air Force. And it's one of the largest aircraft storage and preservation facilities in the world. So just the enormous scale. And here we see an example of clear cutting in El Dorado National Park in California, USA. So these patches, these scars on the landscape. The car, the road, the highway has had an enormous impact on the landscapes of our planet, right? So this is Spaghetti Junction. It's a nickname for this intersection of roads in near Madrid, Spain. Ports, transportation of goods, storage of goods. This is in Los Angeles. This is a port in Newark, New Jersey, close to where Kane University, the US campus is. And here we can see a convergence of train tracks in Georgia in the US. And here we can see Our Lady of Almudena Cemetery in Madrid, Spain. There are 5 million graves here. And so this population of dead people is larger than the population of living people in Madrid. And an enormous kind of transformation of this landscape, right? Here are some oil wells in California. Also just this incredible level of excess to extract materials. Here's a Norwegian gas platform off the coast in Norway. These incredible kind of shifting of landscape and pieces of infrastructure that we have. Ecology is a kind of combination of the word architecture and ecology. And it's a way of thinking about architectural design principles for highly populated areas, but also kind of ecologically low impact. So this is a kind of way to think about architecture not as individual buildings or individual objects, but rather as something part of a system. And I want to talk briefly about, how we can start to think about the reading, which you read this week or last week, the Delanda 1,000 Years of Nonlinear History. And he begins by talking about the sort of origins of the human trace. And then he goes into, he has a very materialist view of history and goes much deeper into how cities emerge and how different types of cultures emerge within these cities. And it's very fascinating. But just to, summarize the first few pages, he talks about these origins of the soft tissue, right? The gels, the aerosols, the muscles, and the nerves that were kind of ruling the planet, right? 500 million years ago. They were in charge. And he speaks about how life underwent this process of mineralization, where the bones emerged as a material. And so it went back to this kind of geological material, in essence. And these bones, he talks about, make, of course, movement possible and eventually set organisms free to inhabit all corners of the planet. And bones, because they can easily petrify, become the first sort of trace, and certainly the first human trace. Geological records are written with bone. And as Delanda mentions, this is our endoskeleton, the skeleton which is inside of us. But over time, we develop an exoskeleton, a skeleton outside of our bodies. And this is architecture. And here's an image I'm sure you guys recognize, but the Great Wall of China. And so this exoskeleton that is outside of our bodies, exo meaning outside of, it's everything from houses made of clay to great monuments made of stone. And just like the skeleton in our bodies, this exoskeleton controls the movement of bodies, controls the movement of people, but also goods and food and information. And so the ruins of architecture that we look at, the skeletons, so to speak, of civilizations and of people, tell a story about this movement of goods, of ideas, of the flow of quote unquote matter energy, as Delanda puts it. And they tell us a rich story. These civilizations go through intense periods of what he calls acceleration, stagnation, and then of course death and decay. And the other article, the shorter one that you guys read this week, talks about the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene is a geologically defined era. We can read this, I can read this for you here. New geological era with no precise start date, marked by significant human impact on climate and ecosystems. The rise of agriculture, deforestation, cement, combustion of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas roused from the earth, extraction and emission. Right, so this is the kind of definition, right? Approximately 1945, in this case, they're saying, to now. And this is a geologically defined era. I want to make that very clear. This is how, you might, as a historian or as a biologist or as an architect, right, define certain eras of time in different ways. But from a geological standpoint, we have entered a new phase called the Anthropocene, a defined era, which is basically, as it says, marked by significant human impact. And so it is left as a trace in the kind of geological strata. It's been altered, and our impact is permanently written in the geological record. To put that into perspective, the last official geological period was the Holocene, and it lasted about 11,500 years. So it's undoubtedly significant that we have entered a new period in geological terms due to human impact. So what are the traces in our geological strata which will define us if anybody could go back or ever would or could study humans? Well, it's precisely the kind of things we've looked at, right? Agriculture has completely altered the face of our planet and changed ecosystems. Concrete, not easily recyclable, and lasts a long time. And this is a particular issue for architects to think about, obviously. We're engaged in building. And China, in particular, pours more concrete than anybody else in the world. Between 2011 and 2013, China poured more than 6.6 gigatons of concrete, which was more than the US poured in the entire 20th century. And of course, the US is no standard for, is no standard for environmentalism either. So this is kind of an amazing sheer quantity, right, of development, which is also fascinating. And, how much has been shaped, how much of the land, country has been shaped in the world. And of course, in many countries, moving away from vernacular architecture and starting to build more cheaply with concrete. This is happening, or has happened, all over the world. Plastic, again, this takes a long time to break down. And of course, we also have microplastics to contend with. But the sheer volume is so immense that this will be a lasting kind of material that's left in the geological strata of our time. Nuclear fallout. And waste in general. And of course, as I said before, the impact of the car, the highways, right? The invention of the car has just drastically transformed the landscape of our planet. We also have large infrastructural projects like dams, which redirect major water systems and also have a lasting impact on the geological strata and can be read. And then oddly, and that's something they bring up in the article, chicken bones. 60 billion chickens are killed every year. And genetically, they're very distinct also from their wild ancestors. And it might seem kind of crazy to imagine it, but this is actually a significant contribution to the geological strata, which will tell a story about our time. So again, back to bones. And I just like to end on this last quote. We live in a world populated by structures, a complex mixture of geological, biological, social, and linguistic constructions that are nothing but accumulations of material shaped and hardened by history. Okay, thank you guys, and I'll see you later this week.